May 15th, 1972, 11:43 p.m. Record Plant Studios, West 44th Street, New York City. Studio B. John Lennon sits alone at the piano, his fingers moving across keys that feel cold under the fluorescent lights. The studio is empty now. The session musicians gone home. The producers disappeared into the Manhattan. Even Yoko has left, claiming exhaustion, claiming she needs sleep before tomorrow's mixing session. But John cannot leave. Not yet. Not until he understands what he heard in the control room 3 hours ago. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and like it. The conversation was brief, whispered, probably not meant for his ears. But John has spent years developing the survival instincts of someone whose every movement is monitored by people who view his music as a national security threat. His hearing has become acute, tuned to detect surveillance, to catch fragments of conversation that reveal the true nature of the world he inhabits. The piano tracks are clean, the voice had said. Male, young, familiar. Someone John trusted, someone who had been engineering his sessions for months, someone who knew which microphones captured his voice best, which settings made his guitar sound warm, which techniques brought out the emotional depth in his vocals. The political material is all documented, the voice continued. Every take, every conversation between songs, every planning session, it's all on tape. John had frozen at the piano bench, his hands suspended above the keys, his breath catching in his throat. Through the control room glass, he could see the speaker, Tommy Morrison, the assistant engineer, barely 25 years old, a kid from Brooklyn who claimed to worship John's music, who had begged for the chance to work on the Imagine sessions. The target doesn't suspect anything, Tommy had continued, speaking into a phone that John had never seen him use before. He treats me like part of the family, shares everything, political plans, financial information, personal details about his relationship, his immigration status, his fears about being deported. The target, John Lennon, former Beatle, peace activist, political refugee, reduced to intelligence terminology. The target who was sitting 20 feet away, listening to every word. Now, for hours later, John remains in the empty studio, trying to understand the scope of what he has discovered. He walks to the control room, studies the mixing board, the tape machines, the monitors that have been capturing every sound he has made during months of recording sessions. How much of this equipment belongs to the record company, and how much belongs to agencies that consider his music a form of warfare? He opens the equipment cabinets, searches through cables and microphones, looking for devices that do not belong, for technology that seems too sophisticated for a recording studio, for anything that suggests his creative process is being documented by people other than those making albums. In the back of the main cabinet, behind a tangle of XLR cables, he finds a small gray box connected to the main recording console. The box is warm to the touch, clearly operating, clearly feeding signal to somewhere other than the tape machine. John traces the cable from the box, follows it through the wall, into a utility room he has never entered. The utility room contains equipment that clearly does not belong to a recording studio. Transmission devices, additional tape machines, filing cabinets filled with folders marked with FBI headers and classification stamp. And sitting on a small desk, transcripts of every conversation John has had in the studio since he began recording Imagine 6 months ago. He picks up the first folder, labeled Lennon Surveillance, Studio Recordings, January 1972 through present. The file is thick, hundreds of pages, every session meticulously documented. Not just the songs he recorded, but every conversation, every political discussion, every private moment he thought was protected by the intimacy of the creative process. John opens the folder, begins reading. The first page is a summary of his January 3rd session, when he recorded the piano track for Imagine. But the report focuses not on his musical choices, but on a conversation he had with Phil Spector about donating money to anti-war organizations. Every name mentioned, every amount discussed, every plan shared between songs has been transcribed, analyzed, and forwarded to government agencies. The transcript reads like a courtroom document. Subject discussed providing $50,000 to National Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam. Subject expressed specific interest in funding transportation for protesters to Republican National Convention. Subject mentioned contact with Tom Hayden and other Chicago 7 defendants. Every word is accurate. John remembers the conversation, remembers sharing his plans with Phil, believing they were discussing private philanthropy in the safety of a recording session. He had no idea that Tommy Morrison was transcribing every detail, that government analysts were reading his charitable intentions as evidence of seditious conspiracy. He flips to the second page. January 8th, vocal overdubs for Jealous Guy. But the report documents his conversation with Yoko about their legal strategy for fighting deportation, private discussions with immigration lawyers, confidential plans for establishing residency in other countries, intimate fears about being separated if the U.S. government succeeds in forcing him to leave. Subject revealed that immigration attorney Leon Wilds believes deportation proceedings are politically motivated retaliation for anti-war activities. Subject discussed potential relocation to Canada if appeals fail. Subject expressed concern that marriage to Yoko Ono may be insufficient protection against deportation. John's stomach clenches as he reads his most private fears transcribed with clinical precision. These were conversations he thought were protected by attorney-client privilege, by marital intimacy, by the simple human decency that should protect vulnerable people from having their desperation documented and weaponized again. Page after page, the pattern continues. January 15th, guitar overdubs for How Do You Sleep? But the report details John's anger toward Paul McCartney and his plans to use the song as public retaliation for perceived betrayals. January 22nd, mixing session for Gimme Some Truth, but the documentation focuses on John's criticism of Richard Nixon and his pledge to fund opposition research during the 1972 election campaign. The files reveal that Tommy Morrison has been more than he has been an active intelligence gatherer, asking leading questions during recording breaks, encouraging John to share political plans, creating opportunities for him to reveal sensitive information about funding and strategy and personal vulnerabilities. Morrison successfully elicited information about Subject's financial support for radical organizations by expressing personal interest in anti-war movement, one report notes. Subject provided detailed information about money transfers to Weather Underground contacts and plans for funding legal defense of imprisoned activists. John remembers Tommy's questions, his apparent fascination with the intersection of music and politics, his eager interest in how famous musicians could support social change. What John had interpreted as youthful idealism was actually sophisticated interrogation, designed to extract maximum intelligence while maintaining cover as professional recording assistants. But the most devastating discovery comes on page 47, a detailed psychological profile compiled from months of monitoring his behavior in the studio, his interactions with musicians, his creative process under pressure. The profile concludes that John Lennon represents a significant ongoing threat to national stability due to his ability to influence young Americans through emotionally manipulative music combined with anti-government. The psychological analysis is thorough, professional, disturbing in its accuracy and its implications. Subject exhibits classic narcissistic tendencies that make him susceptible to flattery and validation-seeking behavior. These tendencies can be exploited to gather intelligence, but also make him unpredictable when he perceives threats to his self-image. Subject's political activism appears driven more by personal psychology than ideological commitment, suggesting that personal pressure may be more effective than political arguments in modifying his behavior. John reads his own psychological profile with growing horror. The analysts have identified his weaknesses, his insecurities, his emotional vulnerabilities with clinical precision. They know exactly which psychological pressure points to manipulate, which fears to exploit, which relationships to threaten in order to control his political activities. Subject's relationship with Yoko Ono is central to his emotional stability and political motivation. Threats to this relationship, particularly through immigration proceedings against Ono, represent optimal leverage for behavioral modification. Subject's guilt about abandoning his son Julian creates additional psychological vulnerability that can be exploited through legal or custody-related pressure. The report recommends continued close surveillance with particular attention to new song compositions and political funding activities. It suggests that his recording sessions provide optimal access for intelligence gathering, because the target is most unguarded during creative processes, often revealing information he would not disclose in formal interviews or public statements. John sets down the file, walks to the main studio, looks at the piano where he has spent hundreds of hours composing songs about peace, love, hope. Now he understands that every note he played was being transmitted to analysts who view his creativity as a security threat, who see his artistic expression as evidence of potential terrorism. He hears footsteps outside the studio. Someone has entered the building, is moving through the hallway, approaching Studio B. John quickly returns to the utility room, turns off the lights, listens. The footsteps are familiar, belong to someone who knows the studio layout, who has a key, who is comfortable moving through the space and darkness. Through the utility room door, John sees a figure enter the control room, turn on the mixing board, check the recording equipment. Tommy Morrison, the assistant engineer, the kid from Brooklyn who worships John's music, the federal informant who has been documenting his political activities while pretending to help him record songs about peace and love. John watches Tommy move through the control room with professional efficiency, checking connections, reviewing tape labels, examining the mixing notes from the evening session. Tommy's movements are practiced, routine, suggesting this late-night surveillance work has become standard procedure, as normal as adjusting microphone levels or setting recording inputs. Tommy opens a briefcase, removes a small tape recorder, and begins copying sections of John's vocal tracks onto separate tapes. Not the finished songs, but the conversations between takes, the political discussions, the private planning sessions that John thought were protected by the professional discretion of recording engineers. As Tommy works, John notices details he had missed before. The way Tommy positions himself to capture conversations, the subtle questions he asks to elicit political information, the careful notes he takes during sessions. What John had interpreted as professional dedication was actually intelligence protocol, systematic documentation of every word, every plan, every vulnerable moment. Tommy removes a second device from his briefcase, connects it to the main recording console, begins transferring additional material. John realizes this is not a one-time operation, but an ongoing intelligence harvest. Months of his creative process being systematically stolen and analyzed by people who view his music as a weapon to be neutralized rather than art to be celebrated. After 40 minutes, Tommy completes his copying, packs his equipment, and leaves the studio. John remains hidden in the utility room for another hour, waiting to ensure he is truly alone, trying to process the revelation that his most trusted collaborators in creating music have been betraying him to people who view his songs as threats to national security. When he finally emerges from the utility room, John walks back to the piano, sits on the bench where he has spent hundreds of hours composing, arranging, recording songs that he believed would spread love and understanding. Now he knows that same piano bench has been a surveillance post, that every note he played was being transmitted to filing cabinets in Washington offices where analysts classify his chord progressions as evidence of sedition. He opens the piano, examines the strings, the hammers, the mechanism that translates his touch into sound. Hidden among the strings, he finds a small microphone, positioned to capture not just the music, but any conversation that takes place while he is seated at the instrument. His most intimate creative moments, his private discussions with Yoko, his vulnerable artistic process, all documented by a device concealed inside the instrument he thought was his refuge. John removes the microphone, sets it on top of the piano, stares at it. Such a small thing to represent such a massive violation of trust. Such a simple device to capture such complex emotions, such sophisticated musical ideas, such dangerous political thoughts. He examines the rest of the studio with new awareness, searching for additional surveillance equipment, finding devices hidden in speakers, taped under mixing board panels, concealed in acoustic treatments on the walls. The entire studio has been transformed into an intelligence collection center. Every surface potentially compromised, every conversation potentially monitored. John returns to the utility room, studies the transmission equipment more carefully. The devices are sophisticated, expensive, clearly government-issued, rather than commercial recording gear. Signal cables run from the equipment through the building's infrastructure, suggesting a permanent installation rather than temporary monitoring. This surveillance operation has been planned, funded, implemented with the kind of resources that indicate high-level approval and ongoing institutional support. He opens more filing cabinets, discovers additional folders documenting other musicians, other recording sessions, other artists whose creative process has been infiltrated by intelligence operations. Bob Dylan sessions at Columbia Studios. Joan Baez's recording work in California. Country Joe McDonald's anti-war albums. The files reveal a systematic program of surveillance targeting musicians whose political messages challenge government authority or military policy. One folder contains correspondence between FBI field offices coordinating surveillance operations across multiple recording studios, multiple cities, multiple record labels. The scope of the program is staggering, involving dozens of agents, hundreds of hours of monitoring, massive financial resources dedicated to treating artistic expression as a national security threat. Operation Chaos Melody reads the header on one document. Comprehensive surveillance and disruption of anti-war musical activities with emphasis on preventing political organization through cultural events. John reads tactical summaries describing how recording studios are infiltrated, how engineers are recruited as informants, how artistic collaborators are transformed into intelligence assets. The documents reveal that Tommy Morrison is not an isolated case, but part of a network of music industry professionals who provide information about artists, their political activities, their personal vulnerabilities, their plans for using music to influence political opinion. Another file details disruption protocols designed to interfere with anti-war musical projects through equipment failures, scheduling conflicts, personnel problems, and creative differences that are actually intelligence operations disguised as artistic disagreements. John realizes that many of the technical problems, personality conflicts, and business complications that have plagued his recording sessions may not have been random difficulties, but deliberate sabotage meant to limit his political music. A psychological warfare manual explains how surveillance-based personal knowledge can be used to manipulate artists, exploit emotional vulnerabilities, and discourage political activism. Artists are pressured through relationships, careers, and immigration status rather than direct threats, creating an environment where continued activism feels personally dangerous. John now understands why his deportation proceedings are so complicated, why his label pushes him away from political content, and why his relationships have become sources of stress. The pressure is coordinated and systematic, forcing him to choose between political conscience and personal survival. As dawn breaks over Manhattan, John sits in the compromised studio thinking about Imagine and Give Peace a Chance, songs that envision peace and question authority, songs considered dangerous enough to justify surveillance. He understands that his studios, conversations, and creative process have been monitored and analyzed as intelligence material. John makes a decision. He will continue recording, knowing every note is documented and every word scrutinized. He understands his music is being copied, archived, and analyzed, but also knows something his surveillance team does not. Music cannot be controlled. As he leaves the studio, John realizes that while his voice is monitored, it cannot be silenced. Files can be built, tapes archived, lyrics analyzed, but the songs have already escaped. Imagine is already inspiring people to question war and envision peace. No surveillance can contain what lives in human hearts. No intelligence operation can neutralize hope once it has been set to music. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment with your thoughts on the video. I always enjoy reading your feedback.